So I wanted to talk with you about the way that we picture the role of the body in the process and practice of yoga. And I want to start by telling you a story, a piece from the Shiva cycle that happens after the marriage of Shiva to Parvati and after their honeymoon, which involves a long, very long period of deep, intimate exploration of the continuous nature between consciousness and its creative potential, with Shiva, of course, representing the principle of consciousness, and Shakti as Parvati representing the creative force that is inherent to consciousness and that animates consciousness and that allows it to become reflectively aware of itself and to revel in its creative unfoldment. So this story begins with Shiva away from home, having gone off once again into a mountaintop retreat to meditate. And whenever Shiva goes off into his meditation, these meditations can last very long. He goes for very long periods of silent sitting and becomes, he encloses into himself and explores the abyss of his own consciousness. And when this happens, Parvati, she sort of starts to lose her creative inspiration in his absence because he is the witness that inspires her to unfold her creative potential. So just before Shiva left and after their honeymoon, Parvati had started talking about potentially bringing a child into the world and asking Shiva what he thought about it. And his attitude was sort of like, I'm not saying no, but when the time is right, well, maybe we'll talk about it later. And she was becoming a little bit, a little bit impatient with him. And the more she would ask, the more he would say, we'll talk about it later. And, later, of course, could mean like in a few centuries in this particular time scale. So, it's not terribly reassuring for Parvati, and she's becoming sort of impatient at him. And they're not able to converse about this very momentous issue without tempers flaring. So Shiva decides that he's going to go off for a while and be alone, so he goes off to do his solitary practice. And so Parvati is at home, and she's spending a lot of time in her bath, reclining, which is a large abalone shell. You can't get them like that anymore. It's illegal now to poach abalone, but she has a massive abalone shell, and she likes to float in these herb-infused waters and with bubbles, no doubt. And she hangs out there. And this is, of course, a metaphor for the reclining of the creative force, the reclining of Kundalini into a sort of dormant state. So she's resting in the primordial waters of her bath and rather than unfolding her creative potential in Shiva's absence. So here she is, and she's sort of forlorn. She's a little lonely. She's dreaming. The maternal instinct is particularly strong, and she's contemplating, how lovely it would be to have a little baby to hold, to coddle, to play with, etc. and she's swirling the bubbles in her bath, and she's watching the light change in these fractal patterns on the surface of the bubbles. And she takes some bubbles and she starts to rub on her arm. She's doing a little exfoliating, and she pulls some skin cells off of her arm, and she stares into them, and she sees them start to vibrate just from her stare. As she focuses her Shakti into those cells, they start to sort of vibrate with life once again. And so she thinks, wait a minute, I don't need him. I can do this myself, yeah? So she starts to chant some low guttural syllables into these, some syllables of the deep creative force into these cells, and they start to hum and resonate with the magic of this mantra. And the attendants outside her bath, who are used to just waiting around while she bathes for hours and days and weeks on end, they're standing around, and they start to feel the earth trembling, and they think like an earthquake is coming, right? And before they can even open the door to the bath to see if the goddess is okay, they find themselves toppled over, and with a sort of wave of the spatio-temporal matrix opens up from within the hands of Parvati and sends a ripple. It's like a shock wave that knocks the attendants over, and they're like tumbled into a pile outside of her bath. And when they come to and finally get to their feet and open the door and look inside, all the water from the bath has evaporated, and the bath is filled with steam, and there is the goddess in this empty abalone shell, in sheer delight, coddling this beautiful baby boy. So Parvati starts to spend her days just playing with this little being, this perfect little being that she shaped out of her own creative powers, this being that she made and designed just as she would want him. And they spend their days coloring and singing and rolling around in the grass and just having a beautiful romantic time. And she's just filled with a deep sense of fulfillment and delight at her creation. And she starts to imagine the moment when Shiva comes home and finds her with this beautiful baby boy. And she decides that she would like for Shiva to encounter the baby boy when he first comes back into the door before seeing her. And so, but of course, time passes. Shiva continues to meditate up on his mountain. Time passes, and the boy grows into a very strong young man. He's no longer a baby anymore. He's kind of portly. He's kind of round and soft because the goddess made him for cuddling. And he has, of course, already another brother whose name is Skanda, who was birthed by other miraculous means, but he was birthed specifically to slay a particular demon. And so from the time he came into their lives, he was like the overachiever. Skanda's quite goal-oriented, and he's always out trying to do good in the world, which is all fine and good, but he's never there to really for Parvati to enjoy his childish mind. He's always out, and in fact, Parvati didn't give birth to Skanda. That's a different story, but Skanda's not actually shaped out of her flesh in the way that this new baby boy is. So Skanda's already out. He's slayed the demon for whom he was born to slay, and nonetheless, he spends all his time out sort of, fighting other battles, and he's a warrior, right? So he's very athletic and, very, very analytical, and he's always away, and so he's sort of useless for for the purposes of fulfilling Parvati's maternal instincts. So Parvati starts to post this young boy, that she created out of her own flesh, outside the door to her bath whenever she's reclining, which again is a lot. Like she's spending a good amount of time in the bath, okay? And she posts him outside the door so that when Shiva comes back, he's the first person that Shiva encounters, okay? Because she just wants to see what will happen. If there's this strange, handsome young man standing outside the door to her bath when Shiva comes home. Okay? So Shiva does decide to come home, a long, long time later, and he's on his way. And of course, Shakti sort of knows this, so she makes sure that her handsome young son is standing outside the door when Shiva comes home. And Shiva's been out. Shiva has somehow encountered Skanda, or Skanda has, encountered him, or maybe went looking for him while they were away. So now he's coming home with Skanda, and of course with his entourage of misfits, his ganas, his, all of these beings that don't fit comfortably in society are always trailing behind Shiva and following him. So here comes Shiva with his entourage of misfits and with Skanda coming up over the horizon, coming toward the home of Parvati and Shiva. And Shiva sends Skanda along to announce that he's coming home, right? Which is already a little in bad taste, right? But this is what happens when you go off into solitary practice for too long. Your social graces sort of deteriorate. You start making bad relationship decisions, and it comes back to bite you. Okay? So he sends Skanda along, right? And remember that Skanda, because Skanda was born into the world particularly to slay a certain demon and to continue to slay demons and to sort of, fight for the ascendance of good over evil, etc. He represents a certain force of will, right? A certain concentrated force of will that is, guided by intelligence, but very much about ambition, determination, and so on. And particularly as that, of course, is organized by the ego, right? And Skanda's got a nice ego. He's always fighting for good causes, right? But he's quite egocentric nonetheless. He doesn't quite have the same soft, watery, devotional spirit of his brother that he's not yet aware of. Right? He has a very fiery nature. So he comes kind of strutting, as he does, up to the home of his mother, of course, respectfully, right? But with a little extra kick in his step. And he goes through the house and he goes back to his mother's bath, and he sees this handsome young man standing at the door. Oh. So he walks right up to this unknown figure who's standing just with his chin upright, not saying anything and not even acknowledging Skanda's presence. And Skanda, he's pretty already a little miffed by the fact that this being who seems to be an intruder in his mother's house is not acknowledging him as he comes through the door. So he walks up and he says, "Who are you?" And the boy says, "I'm Parvati's son." And so Skanda thinks that he's like mocking him, of course, because he thinks he's Parvati's only son, right? So he thinks that this guy is being smart with him, right? But he doesn't want to create violence in his mother's house, right? He feels immediately this impulse to just tear this guy to shreds, but he restrains himself because he doesn't want to create unnecessary turmoil. So he says, "Step aside." And the boy doesn't budge. And he says, "If you don't step aside, I'm going to have to remove you." And the boy, and he's already sized this guy up, and apparently this guy is like no army general, okay? And Skanda's like the best of the best, so he's ready for this altercation, right? And so the guy's just standing there. He doesn't budge. And so Skanda takes a hold of him and tries to grapple him aside so that he can go into the door to his mother's bath. And he's astonished to find that he can't budge this figure at all, that this figure has all of the great sort of mobility and groundedness of the earth itself, right? Because I said a moment ago that this boy has a very watery nature, but even more than that, he has, like Parvati, a very deeply earthy nature. He really embodies the earth element more than anything, and more on that in a bit. But so he tries to move this figure, and he just doesn't budge. He struggles with him for a moment, and then finally the boy just goes, and he distends his big belly, and shoots Skanda back, and Skanda falls on his butt, slides down the hall, and lands right at Shiva's feet. It's absolutely humiliating, right? Like, this has never happened to him before. And Shiva looks down at him, and Skanda is looking up, just in sheer disgrace. Okay? And Shiva kind of pushes him aside and walks up to the door and sees this handsome, young, white, portly, soft boy standing at the door to his wife's bath. And he says, "Step aside." And the boy doesn't budge. And so Shiva, who's notoriously short on patience anyway, especially after he's been meditating, just takes his left thumbnail and nicks off this boy's head. And so the head hits the floor, rolling, shrieking, screaming, and Parvati, who's inside the bath, kind of, just a moment ago was delighting in the unfolding drama of the moment, like, is suddenly filled with rage, yeah? And she shrieks, and Shiva already, as soon as he hears her shriek, he's like brought back to himself, and he's backing up, because Shiva, who sleeps in cremation grounds, who is goes into the very darkest, deepest, and darkest caverns of consciousness, and who really is, mostly a stranger to fear, is terrified of Shakti, okay? Because he's powerless to oppose her. Because as Shakti, she's the source of all force, of all power. Right? And so he can't oppose her because his power derives from her, right? So she shrieks and Shiva's, oh God, what have I done? So he's already backing up. But when Parvati shrieked, a whole band of yoginis came out of her scream and hit the ground and spread out through the hall and started to slaughter the Ganas, Shiva's misfits. They just start with, fangs and claws, just start to tear apart Shiva's entourage. Yeah, it's really, sorry. And so Shiva starts begging and pleading with her, like, I didn't know who this was. He sort of realizes in the very moment that she shrieks that this was a part of her, right? And so he realizes, oh, this is your child. And so he's backing up saying, I can fix this. Please get your yoginis to back off of the misfits. And she says, I will not do that until you make this right. So he's just basically running at this point backwards, winding his way through these yoginis, and he runs out from the house just trying to find some space to think about what he's going to do. And he just keeps running, and he runs over the hill and far enough away so that he's not hearing the shrieks of this terrible scene that's happening. And he comes into a clearing, and he finds in this clearing a white elephant whose name is Aravat. And this elephant came into the world during the churning of the cosmic ocean, which is a particular mythological episode in which Shiva did something truly remarkable. Basically, he saved the world, so to speak, in an act of supreme compassion. And Aravat was brought into the world through that very same episode, and he saw what Shiva did. He saw how Shiva drank the poison that had spread out over the cosmic ocean, and how he neutralized that poison in his throat for the benefit of all beings. And so ever since that he was born, he came into the world out of those cleared primordial waters just some moments later. So he had always felt this deep affinity, admiration, devotion, love for Shiva, although he was given at that particular moment to Indra, and he was Indra's vehicle for a long time. Okay? But by this point in the story, Indra was, basically retired. Okay, people weren't worshiping, revering Indra with quite the same fervor anymore, and so Aravat himself had retired, and so he was sort of, in that fourth phase of the Vedic life in which one retreats into solitude in order to devote oneself full time to spiritual development. And he had spent his time doing bhakti rituals to Shiva. So he's been in the woods doing bhakti rituals for decades, maybe centuries at this point. Yeah, meditating on the image of Shiva, chanting Shiva's name, and suddenly Shiva walks into his clearing, and he's just stunned. He's speechless and stunned by the sudden appearance of the very object of his spiritual devotion. And Shiva sees that he's stunned, and he recognizes Airavat as one of his most ardent, most passionate, most sincere devotees. So he gives him his power of speech back by touching him on the forehead. And Airavat says, "Oh, my Lord, this is the most blissful day of my life. I've been dreaming about this day for my entire life, and all I've ever wanted is for you to appear before me, and now that you've appeared, my life is perfected, and I could die in this moment complete. Is there anything that I can give you?" And Shiva says, "Well, I could use a head." Okay. So without even thinking, Airavat just bows down, and he bows down right over, there's a chopping block there, where he's been splitting his wood to make his bhakti fires. So he puts his head right down on the chopping block, and Shiva, being so compassionate, doesn't want to leave this poor soul on the chopping block for too long. So without hesitation, he takes that trusty left thumbnail and slices off the head of this beautiful, white, devoted elephant. He takes the head of the elephant, he goes running back toward the house. He sees over the distance all of the, he starts to hear the screams of the yoginis and of the ganas who are being terrorized by them. He sees smoke because the whole place is on fire now, and he starts winding his way through the yoginis like an American football player with the head in one hand. And he goes into the house and back toward the entrance to the bath where Parvati's son is still sort of stumbling around blindly, headless. And he takes this elephant head and he places it on the body of Parvati's son. And Parvati's there watching him, and he kneels down as he places this elephant head on the body, and is filled with wonder and joy and sadness and love as the eyes start to blink and this little boy starts to feel into his new head. Right? And at that moment, Parvati is watching, and she sees Shiva finally recognize her son as an object of her deepest love, right? And as a reflection of her, an emanation of her spontaneous creative power. And she sees him, in other words, looking at her son with the same love that she looks at her son. And in that moment, she understands that Shiva recognizes this boy as his son, and she just softens. And when she does that, the yoginis just dissolve. They fall back into the earth like Virabhadra had done, and they just dissolve, because of course they were just an extrusion, an emanation of her rage. So as she softens, so do they. And so the ganas they sort of disperse and chill, and Parvati and Shiva are then rebalanced. Okay? So that's the story of how Ganesh gets his elephant head, yeah? And Ganesh represents the, he is said to be the presiding deity of the Muladhara. And he has a sort of deep, earthy energy to him. And so in many Hatha traditions, he's said to be the keeper of the door to the central channel of the body, right? He abides at the lower opening of Sushumna Nadi, the resplendent central channel of the body, and he is a sort of he's the gatekeeper to that door, right? And his mother, of course, is Shakti or Kundalini, right? And so she's said to abide right at sometimes she's said to be, sleeping just outside Sushumna Nadi with her mouth sealing the entrance. But in any case, the idea is that that in some sense Ganesh is the deity that we have to propitiate to, or if you like, he's the sort of vibrational pattern that we have to confront and that we have to engage with in order to bring our awareness into the central channel, and so to unite with Shakti. Okay? So what happens in this story allegorizes a particular way of wrongly approaching the central channel, and that is to imagine that one can get access to the goddess, that one can unite one's awareness with the goddess, that one can experience that union of Shiva and Shakti through some force of will, right? And that's what's represented by Skanda coming to the door, and then a sort of hot-headed Shiva coming to the door and saying, oh, well, who's this? This is going to stand in my way, And the idea, and you get these warnings all over the Hatha Yoga text that if you approach the yoga practice with too much ambition or with too much with too much ego, with too much force, supposing that somehow through a force of will you can catalyze this process of Kundalini awakening and uniting with consciousness, or Shiva and Shakti uniting, that you can, in various ways, you can be confronted by, or even, deranged by, assaulted by a very dangerous emanation of Shakti, right? That, in other words, Shakti may come back to sort of harm or derange you if you approach her like that, right? You've heard these warnings. Okay? So the Ganesha represents in that 5 or 6-fold scheme of the body that I introduced to you at the beginning of this retreat. He represents Deha, or the outermost sphere of the body, that is the physical body, the body of flesh and bone. Right? That's what Shiva represents. Ganesh, I meant to say. Ganesh represents the Deha, the densest manifestation of the body, because he represents, as the earth element, he is the densest emanation of consciousness. The earth element is the last element to manifest from the diversification of consciousness into individual parts, and it's the densest, right? And Ganesha, of course, is a very portly, dense figure, right? And the way that he's usually shown is having a large belly, right? But it's a belly that's lifted, And he often has a snake tied around his stomach, and it's usually like right around the navel. You can see there's a cobra there representing Kundalini, Shakti. And it's in that belly that prana and apana are said to unite in many of the Hatha traditions. And he's usually sitting with at least one of his legs in a very strong external, but easy external rotation, indicating that his apana is particularly well tonified. He's a very strong aponic force. His apana is really open and really active, and yet he's got this lifted belly, and he's usually sitting in a very easeful posture, a meditative posture, with his very long nose that's good for pranayama practices, and his massive ears that are good for nada yoga, for the reception of subtle sound. And as such, he is the deity of, the patron deity of practices like pranayama and nada yoga and other practices that are central to hatha yoga, or central to this basic idea of working on a physiological level to balance the forces, let's say, of prana and apana, in order to induce more expansive states of consciousness, in order to draw attention inward to those more subtle and more refined and yet more foundational spheres of our being. And that's the kind of practice that we have been exploring. It's the kind of practice that Ashtanga Vinyasa Yoga is. It's the kind of practice that goes with the pranayama that we've been doing, and the subtle body visualization that we've been doing, and the chanting that we've been doing. This is all so many ways of working on a physiological level with deha, right? And of course, with more subtle layers. But we start, right, with the densest layer of the body, precisely in order to try and internalize the attention, and so to move the attention further and further closer to that source, that deep, pulsating source of vibrant, creative energy that is symbolized in these mythological stories as the sensual union of Shiva and Shakti, right? So how we approach the body in these practices is absolutely essential to whether or not they have any true transformative effect, whether or not they actually open up for us and allow our attention to move deeper. And of course, when we first approach these practices, we bring a lot of ambition, and we bring a lot of agenda, and we bring a lot of false ideas about what progressing in yoga might mean. Because in the beginning, we don't have a whole lot. It's totally natural, right? It's because we don't have a whole lot else to work with besides a few probably, sparing and perhaps spread out experiences of, let's say, experiences of the sublime, elevated experiences that give us some taste of our deep existential continuity with other beings. And so they give us a taste for something that we then recognize as as on the horizon of these different yoga practices. And so we get into it, right? Because we are driven fundamentally, all of us, every single one of us, are driven fundamentally, according to this tradition, by this basic desire for intimacy, a basic desire to experience the unfoldment of reality, right? Even our survival instinct is is a sort of variation, if you like, of that most basic impulse. And so is our interest in other beings, right? Whether that takes the form of a sort of romantic interest or of, being inspired by the joy of a child, or being inspired by, the great ideas of some artist or thinker. That all of this is a natural diversification of this basic desire for intimacy. So we have that basic desire for intimacy, and we recognize, or we hear, we understand, something inside us understands that these yoga practices may help, right? That there's a promise there that we may experience greater intimacy with the sources of our being by undertaking these kinds of practices, right? Which usually involve, in some sense, stripping ourselves down, breaking ourselves apart, creating space to feel ourselves on some more primitive, more fundamental level, right? So we get into these practices and we're trying to understand how it works, and we get all of these images of people doing fancy postures, or we hear these stories about people holding their breath for 15 minutes at a time, or sitting still for 25 days without moving or eating, etc. We hear all of these sort of wondrous feats of yogic experimentation, and we confuse those symbols as symbols of attainment, right? And so we start to work ardently to try and re-sculpt our bodies so that they'll do that same kind of back bend, or that same kind of handstand, or looks like we're being visited by another one of Shiva's misfits. And so we operate quite naturally, right? Quite forgivingly from a place of egocentric fascination and egocentric projection, right? And it sounds, almost even as I describe it, it sounds like a bad thing. It's not necessarily a bad thing. It's totally natural. It's what one does when one starts out on the yogic path, and maybe one continues to do it, at varying degrees all throughout one's journey, or at least for quite a long time. But of course, then one starts to do violence to oneself. Quite easily this happens, right? Even if you're of the opinion that you shouldn't do violence to your body, right? You may find, most of the practitioners that including perhaps yourself, who have done violence to their bodies, are of the opinion that one ought not do violence to one's body with the practice. But it's one thing to be of the opinion, and quite another thing to never succumb to that particular confusion oneself, right? And so what happens is that you do harm. You can do harm to your body, and you can do great harm to your mind too, especially if you're working not just with the outer layer of the body, but working on a deeper level with breath, and working on a deeper level with attention. And so working with the sort of more the finer equipment of your yoga practice, the finer structure of your subtle body can be damaged quite easily by unnecessary and ambitious force. Yeah? And of course, what we're trying to do, or one way of understanding what we're trying to do, which we've talked about in a number of on a number of different occasions in the last couple weeks, is that we are trying to simply bring our attention to a process that's always already happening anyway, right? Which is the process of our natural psychological and physical unfoldment, and the unfoldment then of our momentary experience from the very deepest levels of our being out to the most ordinary, visible, tactile objects of our experience. And we're simply trying to make ourselves supple enough, open enough, and receptive enough so that we can feel that process happening spontaneously and feel the inherent bliss and revelry that belongs to that process quite independently of ourselves, so that we can allow that quality of bliss and revelry to permeate upward from those deepest levels of our being and permeate the more outer sphere of our conscious experience, so that we can see ourselves as participating in that divine revelry in every moment of our lives. And in order to do that, we have to, of course, the ego has to dissolve, right? It has to get out of the way. So that part of us that's constantly trying to perfect the practice, right? Constantly trying to do better, right? That has to soften, right? And of course, the worst thing that you could do is try and cut that out violently, try to hack it off, amputate it, right? Because that, of course, is an expression of the very thing that you're trying to feel into, right? That's part of the process too. That too is a direct emanation of the feminine creative force, of the Shakti that you're trying to feel into. And so if you take a condemning attitude toward even that, right, then you're already closing yourself off from feeling into the fullness of your experience, right? So you don't try and, in some sense, of course, it's a platitude, a sort of truism that you're supposed to practice with no attachment, right? How's that going for you? How does that? Because of course it's inherent in action. It's inherent in purposeful undertaking that there's, in some sense, something that you're trying to manifest, right? Without that, you become utterly useless, right? So it's not that it's not that you have no purpose, right? It's not that you practice without trying anymore, right? Or without without any effort to. There's the effort. It's the effort of exploration, though, rather than the effort of bringing about a particular result, right? We're trying to practice in a spirit of inquiry, in a spirit of exploration and experimentation, right? Even as we sort of play with and hold very loosely in our hands these sort of objects or ends of the practice. Because of course it's built into the very structure of the Ashtanga Vinyasa. There's a sort of linear progression, there are sequences. Of course, the mistake is to be too rigid with those sequences, and to be too judgmental of yourself and of your own body and of your own experience as you undertake those sequences. But nonetheless, you allow some natural passion right? That basic desire for feeling the unfoldment of reality, for going deeper, for experiencing something more fundamental, for seeing it again, but for the first time, right? For seeing it anew, for experiencing yourself as you've never experienced yourself before, right? You bring that passion, that desire, you let that flow through you as you practice, right? But without much concern, much attachment to, much sort of obsession or compulsion about where that actually brings you, right? And so what that requires, right, that kind of openness, it requires a loving attitude towards your own body, right? It requires that you recognize that you too are an immediate emanation of Shakti, right? Just like Ganesh. And that the goddess made you exactly as she wants you, right? The goddess made you for the sake of consciousness experiencing itself like that, exactly the way that you're feeling it right now, right? That's part of the play, that you're never outside that, right? Your knee pain, your instability, right? Your fragility, your tears, right? Your feelings of contraction, your feelings of, I'm not good enough, right? Your feelings of despair or of hopelessness that this is not totally coming together. Or then on the flip side, your arrogance about the depth of your backbend or your sort of silly, absurd projection that somehow the suppleness of your joints and tissues is a reflection of your, spiritual attainment or something like that, right? Right? Because when you feel that in yourself, it's even more humiliating than the other stuff. But you have to, right, allow those waves of humiliation to pass through you and, rebalance your perspective, recognizing that all of that is part of this divine play. And that it's only when you acknowledge, just as Shiva finally looked into the eyes of Ganesh, this sort of soft, cuddly, rotund, being who's actually, he's the master of the Hatha Yoga practices. And remember that. That's the image, yeah? That love with which, and that wonder, and that sort of all-embracing joy with which Shiva looks into the eyes of Ganesh, that's what softens Shakti and allows for Shiva for your awareness to pass through the door. Let's chant Om to finish this talk, and we'll feel this Om resonating from deep in the earth of the body, from deep in the subterranean cavern of the pelvis, and we're going to draw it up, drawing the sound long, feeling the various movements of its shape going all the way up the center line of the body and resonating especially across the soft palate and up into the cranial vault, perhaps expanding outward, perhaps expanding upward and beyond. So draw the breath in deeply and bring the attention down. Ooh. Thank you.